BookTV at c-span.org. Up next on Book TV, James Peck argues that the United States has used the idea of preserving human rights as a tool to expand its global reach. This is about an hour 15 minutes.
Good evening. Welcome to the Center for Global Affairs. I think most of you know that I'm Vera Jelinek and I'm the Divisional Dean of this center. Thank you for coming. I see that the weather didn't keep you away, and I'm not surprised. Those of you who form part of Jim Hoge's fan club know that I tend to sort of wax effusive about what goes on in these corridors. Probably one of the fastest growing master's program in global affairs at this school. Continuing education courses, dozens of them year-round, and public events such as the one tonight. More events to come. We're winding down. We're getting closer to graduation at the beginning of May, but there's an event on Monday. The ambassador of Egypt, Ambassador Abdelaziz, will be here in a conversation with a faculty member, Alon Ben Meir. And on Wednesday, we switch gear and we move to exploring energy in the Arctic and also issues of environment. So get in touch and come aboard. I think you will agree that Jim Hoge has again produced an extraordinary series this academic year. Topics have ranged from the financial constraints on the U.S. Remaining a superpower, fault lines between Christianity and Islam, the role that Iran and Turkey might play in U.S. foreign policy, and then the dark side of the internet and the triumph of cities. All this comes after a long list of distinguished authors and topics, including Samantha Power, Peter Galbraith, Niall Ferguson, Ahmed Rashid, and I could go on. I, of course, am the lucky beneficiary because I'm at most of the events. But who else but Jim Hoge could put together such a program? Editor of Foreign Affairs for over 18 years, 3 decades in newspaper journalism, including started as the Washington correspondent and then editor and then publisher of the Chicago Sun-Times. Under his reign, I can say reign, the Chicago Sun-Times won 6 Pulitzers, publisher of the Daily News, and now he's left the editorship of Foreign Affairs, and as of October, I think, he's chair of Human Rights Watch and inaugural director of the Nelson Mandela Center at the new Museum for African Art, which will open either in the fall of this year or the beginning of next. Most important for me, he's one of the founding members of the Center for Global Affairs Advisory Board, and a tremendous source of support. So please help me to welcome Jim Hoge and his guest tonight, James Peck.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. Just before we get rolling here, let's make sure you can hear everything. All the mics work. We're really mic'd up tonight.
We really are. Can you hear both of us?
Yes. We have 2 mics going. We have this one in case everything breaks down. James Peck, he's the author of the book we're going to discuss tonight, and it's entitled Ideal Illusions: How the U.S. Government Co-opted Human Rights. Now, there's some context to this book which I think is important to know about before we go forward. This book is among those published by Metropolitan Books, American Empire Project, and that's a project which questions the changes in U.S. strategic thinking as well as in its military and economic posture. Now, Jim is also the author of Washington's China, the National Security World in the Cold War, and the Origins of Globalism. He publishes a number of articles in the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other publications. And he is the founder of the Culture and Civilization of China Project at Yale University Press, and the China International Publishing Group in Beijing. If I don't quit citations for him, we won't get anywhere tonight. But as you can see, he's a busy man, and I think you're going to enjoy the discussion tonight. He lives in New York City. Earlier this week, I went to a memorial service for Professor Louis Henkin of Columbia University, who is one of the great scholars of human rights, as well as a very renowned law professor in general. And I thought about him when getting ready for tonight, because while he was an ardent advocate of human rights and of its evolution and development and progress and so on, he also knew when to be critical. And one of his criticisms from an article in 1979 seemed to me was very apt for tonight. He was criticizing the US for failing to ratify many international human rights treaties. And what he wrote was this: "In the Cathedral of Human Rights, the United States is more like a flying buttress than a pillar, choosing to stand outside the international structure, supporting the international human rights system, but without being willing to subject its own conduct to the scrutiny of that system." Now that was 1979. Since then, the US has moved from sort of passive tolerance and somewhat dismissive tolerance to co-opting human rights. So writes James Peck. So let's start with that. What is the nature of the co-opting, and what was the goal that we moved to from the more passive role that we took governmentally before?
Well, I first came to the, let me put it in some ways in terms of the title, Ideal Illusions, because there's a line that Harold Laswell, a famous writer about propaganda, wrote in the 20s and 30s when he said, "Sophisticated governments rule better through illusion than they do through coercion." Right. And when I saw that, I thought very much about what was absolutely a central issue about both American ideals and human rights, which is that they present the veneer that they explain who we are and how our power works. But in reality, they're a way in which they allow that power to work without really understanding it. In other words, they become a way of idealizing it, and they become a way in which we say, as we did in the Vietnam era, if only we lived up to our ideals, that's not who we'd be. But when we look at the Russians and they do something wrong, we say, oh, but that's who they are. So we have there already built in a very powerful basic contrast over the role of ideals. And the Cold War, in a sense, which I spend a certain part of the book on at the beginning, moves into the issue of why did human rights emerge when it did, as it did. And what I argue in the book is not that human rights didn't emerge as a language after the Second World War, but that it emerged in a primary way in this country in the 70s. Now it has its predecessor in the Soviet dissident movement, when it first really begins with Helsinki Accords.
Right.
But it emerges as a major public force, as a language, in the early 70s. And these were years when I myself was also very active in the anti-war movement and was very empathetic to Amnesty International as it was founded in London in the early 60s. But as I watched the development of the language in the Congress, because it really, of course, precedes by a decade Human Rights Watch.
Right.
When I watched the emergence of the language, what increasingly concerned me was the divide that was emerging between the issues that had been very central in the peace movement, issues of war, aggression, and also issues in the civil rights movement, equality, restructuring of wealth and power, and that human rights was emerging in a way, what I call the first current, and we can talk about that later, in a way that separated itself off from these other issues. So that it became concerned with valid issues of individual freedom, torture, It was concerned with certain kind of legal rights and free speech, and the kind of issues that are probably much easier for Americans to grapple with. Civil rights,
Yeah.
political rights, rights that when individuals are constrained by caste rather than class, so that there's civil rights and women's rights and gay rights. And yet, watching the emergence of this concern and seeing at the same time a growing gap in inequality, or seeing that multiculturalism and diversity, all to the good, I think, was paralleling an increasing gap of wealth and power. And at the same time, the concern with the laws of war, and there's a place for that, was paralleling a continuation of one war after another. And so it made me begin to think exactly what were we losing. And at the same time, there was sort of a divide that was opening up in American history, because human rights is a word we once used. It wasn't used like we'd used after the Second World War, but it is a word that resonates in American history. It was a word that Teddy Roosevelt used, human rights, but it was used differently. It was human rights versus property. It was human rights versus capital. Now, this is the kind of language that was also disappearing at this time. And for those who remember the kind of arguments that Martin Luther King Jr. made towards the end of his life, when he said, we can't really succeed in the civil rights movement unless we have a peace movement where the two are to come together. If those concerns can't come together, we won't end up with either. And so that's sort of the core of the germinating thoughts in my own life, really, that are part of what I worked out in the book.
Two currents, and you've begun to describe, could we get a bit more precise as to how they have evolved? Because if I understand it correctly, we can talk about this from what the government has been doing,
yes,
since co-opting is a part of tonight's discussion, and then part of what the human rights movement, essentially an NGO movement, has been doing, and where they have come together and how they have come together, how much of it was planned, how much of it just occurred. But human rights becomes a different kind of a movement in the Carter years to the Reagan years to the Clinton years and now to now. In fact, some of the terminology even changes. Democracy becomes a word that covers a lot of things that it didn't before. Can you just sketch out this evolution of human rights as a movement?
Yes, I'll try. I mean, I think the first current, which I've sort of hit on, is much more the civil rights, the individual rights. The second current, which is I was trying to bring back into the human rights discussion what I felt was a wide range of things that both had resonance in American history, but were globally very important. Right. Those, first of all, have to do with issues of equality. But they also have issues to do with radical mobilization and collective struggles for transformation, the decolonialization movement. I mean, it's very hard to imagine that human rights even could have existed if the decolonization movement had not swept the 40s and 50s, right, because the Europeans were not about to invoke human rights in their colonies. Just as it's hard to envision the way in which human rights could have emerged in the United States without the civil rights movement initially succeeding, the conflict with. So the second current is much more about meeting human needs. It asks even why in countries that have the rule of law, basic educational and health and medical jobs are not provided for. It seeks ways of transforming certain kinds of structures of power. And it also looks very much at issues of occupation, war, and the arms race. Yeah. So it has a very, it tends to be something we associate more with the non-Western world, but that's not entirely the case. No. I think there are resonances that cross. Now, how the two came together. At the height of the Vietnam War, in the early 70s, I think much of the old anti-communist consensus began to break apart. And the world that had once been denied as to what the U.S. was doing. The United States didn't act that way. It was the deniability notion. The United States may have had to cooperate with countries that were part of the free world and were not very admirable. They might be dictatorships, but it was part of the free world. But part of the shift in the 70s comes in that the United States is increasingly confronting a world in which the struggles for freedom and the atrocities which are also being put more and more into the media at this time are requiring a different ethos as a way to explain what's happening. Mm-hmm. And so the old anti-communist ethos begins to disintegrate. And the national security managers, I think, it's what national security establishment managers, are very aware of this. And they're very aware, I think, that in order to sustain, as they've known, I think, from the beginning, a global role, you need a mobilizing ideology. You need some sort of explanation for why the U.S. should play the preeminent role that it does. So internally, within the government, there was a growing concern, but it wasn't exactly clear what it was going to be. Externally, you had the issue of Vietnam, as well as the Soviet distance, but fundamentally Vietnam. And I think one of the elements that occurred with human rights in the peace movement is it could go in two directions. And of course it was a wide coalition. But one direction it could go was to use Vietnam as a way to think through how American power functioned and did function for 30 or 40 years. Those would be what I would call, that's much more to do with a more exploitative system of power and why there was such global inequality and injustice. And the other was to say about Vietnam, oh, it was a mistake. If only we'd lived up to our ideals, we wouldn't have done it. And that became, I think, a way of avoiding what Vietnam was ultimately about. And that part became the element which I think Jimmy Carter ran on. He ran on the notion Americans, and I'm not saying Americans aren't, but Americans are a decent people. Their government really would not, if they lived up to who they were, do such things. But within the government, you can look at, as I think my book suggests, that the concern with human rights seemed an ideal way to make America once again look like it was the embodiment, in a very particular and universal way, of what was good. And not only was it the embodiment, but the transformation of what American life was about that was such that with the new means of communication, with the corporatization of the world, with growing consumerism and the rest, that we, in a sense, were a microcosm of what that new world was to be. This is really what Brzezinski wrote about so well when he was National Security Manager, mm-hmm. and why Brzezinski was one of the foremost advocates of human rights. And I think he saw human rights, and in his memorandum explaining why we need an intellectually coherent conception of human rights. It's not coherent as it is. And we need it because it's not going to work as an ideological way of recasting American power unless it can create a positive image, unless we can envision a way that the radical changes that threaten throughout the world, or the movement towards greater egalitarianism, which is a major theme that was of concern, unless those currents could be seen as needing to be moderated. So when I talk about the two currents, my point isn't that they're not both on people's minds. My point is that the first current, which is about the freedoms that we speak of freedom of speech and the
essentially
mobilization.
Civil and political
Civil and
freedom.
political. That when we see governments not using those, the U.S. government ideologically attacks them and undercuts many of the less understandable to us means of struggles for social justice by saying they don't have those.
Let me throw up some of the arguments that the human rights organizations make, and you can bat them down. One is that if they stray too far from the clarity of having law as the kind of the baseline from which to make judgments, that they don't have the resources and it'll get too political and they'll lose on all counts. So better to stick with civil and political rights, because by the way, if you have political rights, that is to say freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and so on, you can address economic and social issues. Whereas you really can't if you don't have the basic framework of freedom to associate, to speak, and so forth. Second argument that is often made is that human rights, at least as a non-governmental function, needs the clarity of clear violations, and what they're going to be. They have to be violations of law, at least in this context, and then clear violators, and then remedies that can be proposed. If you move to mass movements, revolutions, and the such, you're getting into a much bigger field and a more complicated one, and one in which the results sometimes are not exactly what you had hoped. If we look at most modern revolutions, Iran, for example, or Russia, to go back a ways, the outcomes after the revolutions turned on a dime and ended up very repressive rather than more freedom, more pluralistic politics, and so on. Now, excuse me, I'm going on too long, but you got these two currents of Human Rights Watch, and you've got part of the communities that are interested in the subject to the point of action, saying we can handle one, we can't handle the other. The other is for politics, the other is for mass movements, if you will, but not for an organized operation like, say, Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. What do you say to that basic critique that there's only so much that can be done to get anything done?
Well, there are a lot of questions you put in that, yeah. And so I'll try to come up with a few answers, and then you can follow up on a few of those. The first is, I think there are limits to the first current, which allow us to actually deal with the basic human needs. That's true even in this country. I was struck in looking at some of the language that was lost from American history that it was FDR who spoke of economic tyranny in this country, and that the political freedoms in this country were not coping with such realities. Right. And I think arguably this country had the freest speech after the American Revolution of any country on the planet, and slavery existed for 60 years. And indeed, along with that free press, 100 years of segregation thereafter. Now, that's not to say one isn't for the free press. It is to say, however, that a human rights that cannot cope with the fundamental needs driving people for rights of all kinds is not going to have a long and sustainable life on the planet I now see developing. The problem is the first current has chosen legalization, and one understands about laws. But one must, I think, also remember, laws are the result of states. Right. And certain laws are more compatible with states than other kinds of laws. There was a speech, for example, a couple days ago that former President Lula gave. And I thought, in a nutshell, he put it very well. He said, I'm all for freedom of speech and the right to demand I have food, but if the food doesn't result on the table from that speech, there's something deadly wrong about the way our rights are functioning. Now, you're absolutely right that the upheavals can often lead to violence, people point to the Iranian or the various kinds of revolutions that have occurred. But there's the other piece as well that I think is very important in here, which is the history of hostility by the United States to so many revolutions. For example, Nicaragua is one. It's no accident in reality that the human rights movement's language partly did occur out of the overthrow of Allende. But this history of opposition to revolutionary movements is also partly what leads some of these revolutions to do many of the deeds we don't like. For example, you mentioned the Iranian Revolution, hardly a popular revolution to defend. And I do not defend many of the acts that they do.
Right.
But I would point out that I believe the Iranian Revolution would be a different place if Iraq had not invaded them in the late 1970s and had $25 billion worth of arms given to them by the Saudis and the United States. And that the damage done in the internal dynamics of the Iranian Revolution are enormous.
I would go back further and say when we decided to overthrow Mossadegh's government.
Yes, absolutely.
We gave them something that they would never forget. They act like it happened yesterday.
That's right. There's a line that Senator Fulbright used in a book when I was working with him, and I thought is very apt and useful and something I often think about, when he said, the problem for most Americans is that they can never remember what other people tend not to forget. And I think this is part of what we're seeing in the Middle East today,
yes,
which I will probably come to later, which is you don't have to tell Egyptians and people in Turkey and other countries about the nature of American power. There are many aspects of that power they know all about. And this is different from 30 and 40 years ago, when you would have demonstrations in the street and they'd say, down with American imperialism, down with this and that. No, I think a lot of aspects about the nature of American power are understood. And that in reality, what we're seeing in the Middle East today, in a painful, often bloody, but in some ways hopeful, extraordinary movement, is the emergence of the kinds of demands in the second current, which the first current are now also going to have to balance off and deal with. In other words, I'm not trying to advocate for the second current over the first current.
Right.
What I'm trying to say is the American government...
Disproportionate balance, though.
For the human rights movement. But for the American government, they have very shrewdly used the first current repeatedly to discredit even some of what I would consider the relatively moderate efforts of an Allende or the early Sandinista movement to overcome the gap.
By Allende, you're talking about Chile.
Yes.
The archives on our foreign policy on Chile became public a few years back. And I lost whatever relationship I had with Henry Kissinger over it, because we ran a piece on what they told us about our culpability, both through omission and commission, in the horrendous state-controlled upending of the Allende government. So I'm fully with you on that. Is there another thing the human rights movement likes to point to is that there is a core of human rights which is universal. That doesn't matter what your culture is, what your history is, it's there. Is that a useful way of looking at it? You mentioned in the book that in different places there are different kinds of rights that have a different order of priority. And I assume you're referring to economic and social rights, but maybe something else.
I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that rights are universal, but, and there of course you say, I often say to people that I'm teaching in a class, watch for what comes after the word but. But they are historically deeply rooted and variated because of that.
Yeah.
And it's very easy to invoke a right as universal as a weapon. All too easy, I think, rather than deal with the contradictions that often exist, even among rights that are said to be universal, which takes us down into the much more nitty-gritty of trying to figure out in any particular situation how to understand it. There's a phrase that the French thinker Simone Weil used, which I sometimes evoke when I'm trying to think about what I think probably with all men are often extremely difficult situations to sort out. And she said, justice is a kind of attentiveness. And what I think she meant by that is we cannot forget the conflicting components ever when we're looking at a situation.
Right.
We can't forget, yes, there are needs for certain kinds of free speech and the rest, but we can't forget the others as well. For example, as an example, and it's a Chile example, but it's a later Chile example, it's about the human rights groups. In the Nicaragua war, in the war against the Sandinistas, one of the things that was done was under the Reagan administration, and in some ways follows very much upon the Brzezinski-Carter line, Brzezinski on human rights, was when the National Endowment for Democracy and parallel NGO groups began to fund organizations inside Nicaragua, including the newspapers, including newspapers that called for the overthrow of the government. There was very little opposition. I found one line of opposition from human rights groups against this. And this goes right to the core of how you were dealing with the notion of the hostility of the American government and using the first current, which is suppression of the right of the press, which was used, and indeed became the single most effective issue orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency against Allende when he closed down the major media, which the CIA had been funding. Now, one can say that there's nothing wrong, I wouldn't say that, but one could say there's nothing wrong with the NED and other groups funding these internal operations. Because and this is indeed what they did against Pinochet when he was trying to extend his term in office later, and the NED and National Endowment, American government forces funded huge amounts of money into this effort, and the leaders of Human Rights Watch supported it. Now, if that kind of linkage exists, and that's about the democratization, the movement between the two currents, regime change. We're not talking about universal rights per se. We're into the mechanics and operations of power.
We also, this was struck home for me this morning. I had breakfast this morning with a very prominent American of Egyptian origin who's been extremely successful in business here. And he went back to Egypt recently because of the crisis that's there to see if there's something he could do to help. And assuming that because he was Egyptian that they would welcome him. And they did welcome him. But the second sentence was, you must understand, you are no longer a resident Egyptian. And what is happening here now has to be for Egyptians, by Egyptians, and not by any outside, even half Egyptian outside influence. And that, of course, tells you something about the universality of rights, which it may be, but so is the universality of the understanding that the United States is far more powerful than anybody else, and it tends to intervene when it shouldn't.
Yes, and it also, I think, points to something that is both extraordinarily important about what's happening in the Middle East, because I think we are watching an historical event as important as the disintegration of the Soviet Union. But we're watching as well something that is very central to what, call it strategic communications by Washington, call it propaganda, call it what you will. But the basic message in the Middle East, as it has been in other parts of the world, is to the educated classes. It is to the academics and the business people and this is a fairly small stratum of people.
Right.
It's also the stratum the human rights community, by and large, tries to reach. I'm not saying they don't take very good stands on people who are tortured or not from those groups at all. But I am saying that one of the concerns that has preoccupied the American government from the earliest days of the Cold War on has been a concern with what they called radical intellectuals. This is going to come back to your main point in a minute. And radical intellectuals were understood as people who wished to transform their own societies, not necessarily not drawing on ideas from outside, but basically through mobilizing the poor, the discontented, the middle class, trying to find their own way. And the primary, I would argue, objective when I read the national security documents of the United States is, how do we create a globalized community where the people in these countries feel their greater allegiance is not to their country, but to their career, or to their class, or to their global links. but not deep down in their own people. And this has been something that, as I say, has haunted and concerned the American government for decades. So I think when you say you go and an Egyptian goes back and he wants to be deeply involved, this is indeed, it is important that people do be deeply involved. But we're dealing with something that has not been compatible with the way the American global system has arranged for a dynamic relationship with, say, an Egyptian revolution. I think there's a deep contradiction here. Now, contradictions are not necessarily incompatible, but the conflict between, when I say rights are contradictory, we're struggling with exactly this issue of how to broaden out and deepen human rights so that if somebody goes back to Egypt and says, well, the issue is freedom of speech and stops there, you're not going to get very far anymore. No. And we're not going to get very far anymore because the world has changed out from under us. It is a world in which the young, and I don't include myself, alas, as one of them anymore, but we are a world where people are see, I'm not even going to use the right words. I mean, Twittering and they're online and they're seeing all these things, but the images.
Yeah.
And the visual images, and mobilizing, and Facebook, and all of this. That's a section, a very important section. And then you have in Egypt as well, a lot of these people who are educated, but their future is very bleak.
Right.
They have very few jobs in front of them.
Yeah.
There's no sense of an organized way of organizing the society that's going to recreate work and jobs. FDR's challenge was enormous, but it was smaller compared to this. But some of the issues do resonate. And unless the human rights language becomes part of that world as well, I think its future is going to remain what it has too often been, which is tied into the structures of wealth and power of the United States and, to a degree, of the Europeans.
The last 4 or 5 decades, when human rights evolved into what it is today, which is a front and center issue with all sorts of government and non-government organizations involved. We've got the UN Declaration of Human Rights. We've got the Geneva Conventions. We've got the Right to Protect, which is the latest one to come along, and is very current right now because this is one of the explanations as to why we have a right to go into, when I say we, I mean the international community, to go into Libya at the moment. Do you have some comments on whether this internationalization, organizationally, of human rights is primarily a plus, or are there some big minuses as well, and particularly on the right to prevent? Because as you mentioned, one of the major phenomena of post-World War II is the decolonization of the world. And I'm just wondering if the right to prevent doesn't look differently from the other side of colonialism than it does here.
Well, I think it does, and I'll come to that if I can in 1 minute. The first is this notion of the international community is a very elusive one.
Yes, it is. It's handy.
It's handy, and it's also very selective.
Yeah.
And it tends, when you really look at it, to start to get a little smaller. Sometimes it's the United States and Europe, and sometimes it includes the Indians, and sometimes not. Sometimes the Chinese, usually not. Some of the South Americans, but maybe not Lula. By the time you get down, and we'll talk about this in regards to Libya, it starts to be all too often still too close to a Western club. Not exclusively.
Yeah, let me just add, because right to your point, right now we have you can hear on the airwaves, a consensus to go into Libya and straighten things out a bit. And we can do so because the Security Council okayed it. Now, the okay of the Security Council involved all sorts of abstentions by countries, and many of them on the rise. Brazil, it wasn't just China, it wasn't just Russia, and it was Germany. So it's a very unclear picture as to what it means that there's an international community with a consensus to act.
That's right. I don't think there is an international community to act. Now, on the Libyan situation, I would use from my own experience in writing this and thinking about it, a few rules of thumbs. I have a feeling I'm going to have more than 2 thumbs. One is have no illusions. When powers intervene, they do so significantly for their own interest. I don't think they do it just for the freedom and the ideals and the rest. These are part of what justify, but I don't think they explain. So the first is have no illusions. Secondly, I strongly dissent from the notion that these are humanitarian acts. If you want to go to war, you go to war. This was Doctors Without Borders' position on Rwanda. It's a war, and they weren't against it. But don't call it humanitarian. A humanitarian war is a monstrosity in their terms. Now, this I agree with. Humanitarianism is extremely important, but it's shifted its meaning radically since the 1990s because it has become a way of integrating all sorts of elements into aid programs, counterinsurgency, nation building, failed states. It's not what it once was. And I think that's a great tragedy. Humanitarianism still, as an independent, non-nation building function, is absolutely central. Third, on Libya, I think, again, President Lula, who I think is former President Lula, is an extremely interesting figure, said the problem we have, in part, is we have a 20th century UN in a 21st century. And there are contexts in which military force might well be useful, but it's absolutely clear that not a single major power at the moment, particularly the United States, wants the UN to have autonomously such power, so they would operate apart from our own. But if one were truly serious about the power to protect, the two do go together. That's not incompatible with a stance for the human rights community to take. And on the particular thing that's happened, again, on the power to protect, I think when I read, I was going to say the international media, but then I decided to scratch that word. When I read the media from various parts of the world, I'm seeing first that an astonishing reaction, really, which is the Western powers are... Does this work? Yes. That the Western powers, once again, are the ones truly intervening.
Yeah.
The old colonialists are back. It's not going to work. That era, I think, is over. The second is they clearly moved significantly, I think, beyond what the resolution was about. And that's widely seen.
Talking about the resolution on
the
Libya.
UN, yes, the 1973 resolution. And on the internet. And the third, which I think is really quite striking about Libya, which is a tragic, messy, possibly civil war, led by a regime that we would all like to see go. Nonetheless, what was notable is no effort by the Security Council to institute an immediate ceasefire call, to ask somebody like Lula or Mekebe or others to go in, as the African Union asked for, and to try to see if there were any way to move towards a non-violent conclusion. Now, I'm not saying it would work, but it was notable it wasn't tried. The speed with which Western powers moved in was stunning. And as I say, I don't think this is going to work anymore. I think we're going to see in the Middle East over the next 10 years upheavals of all sorts. And as they come, some are going to be ones that struggle, perhaps like your friend in Egypt wanted, a different kind of Egypt. Some are going to be brutally repressed.
Right.
But it's a changing world, and that world can't change unless it both meets the basic needs of its people and tries to find ways to do so with freedoms that may take some slightly different forms than we have, and yet they're important. So in answer to one question is, yes, they're universal, but the particular forms they take are going to come out of different struggles in different ways.
Yeah, and it may not be just a Middle East phenomenon for too much longer. For a lot of the conditions that are there, overpopulation, economic dysfunction, a huge new youth population to be dealt with, and the increasing prevalence of social media.
Well, I was reading...
Could also apply to Central Asia very soon.
All over. There was a study that was recently done, and studies are notoriously, once you listen sort of with one ear and out the other, and statistics are anybody's game, whether it's on American economy or whatever, by a Serbian economist who works for the World Bank by the name of Milanovic. But what he did, he was really actually trying to look at what inequality was about in the world. And the statistic that he finally came up with, which is now being widely debated, is that 2/3 of the planet live less well off than the bottom 5% of Americans. Now, that says something about the nature of the world, the billions of people
that's a stunning
that we have to deal with.
Yeah.
And I've often wondered on human rights, when this is sort of a Vietnam example, but it'll resonate what this is about. When My Lai happened, it was obviously when the massacre at My Lai happened and the pictures came out, it was horrifying. And it was, you could have an immediate visceral response to it.
Do you know where they first appeared? Yes.
Well, that's actually why I mentioned it. There was no other reason at all.
No, the Chicago Sun-Times broke the My Lai
Well,
story.
you deserve great plaudits for that. On the other hand, trying to get people to respond to B-52 bombings and fire zones in the same way. If human rights lived in a world where people responded to both the same way, that's not human rights' fault.
Yeah.
But if they responded the same way, we'd have a different sense of human rights. And so I sometimes think that if the floor here suddenly was all turned into glass, and we could see beneath us everybody who was poorer than us, and we had to live every hour of the day thinking about how our lives were looking at all those people who had less, it would be a different world, I think, and it would put the urgency of justice, which I think does motivate the best of the human rights activists,
Right.
center to the world. But as part of that, they need, I strongly believe, and that's part of what the two currents are about, they need to disassociate their language from the extent to which it's become enmeshed in the language of Washington and too many people who speak in the words of power. In other words, democratization, transparency, I could go through a whole list. People throw these words around. I think in a way they're thought-stopping words. They don't take us very far. And too many people use them too easily. Now, don't take this personally, because it's not about you at all. But there was a line that, again, Senator Fulbright, a person who I think was a very shrewd person. But I once asked him, I said, why didn't you ever join the Council of Foreign Relations? And he said to me, well, you know, they're actually quite very nice people. And I really quite often like talking with them.
Yeah.
But, you know, it's hard with such people to retain your sense of confidence about difference. And he said, even when they argue, and he said they do argue, but they often start to argue in the same terms. They do studies, and these studies end up having the same words in them. And even when they're disagreeing with each other, he said, that's what we have to watch for. And I said to him, it's a little like what Wittgenstein said years ago. He said, the limits of our words are the limits of the world we see. And so part of this effort to think about the second current of human rights and to bring this other vocabulary in, and these other ways of thinking in, is to shatter that language where so much of it's shared. After all, how many people really know, even outside certain activists in the human rights community, what's really going on in the rest of the world? And how to bring that in. Now,
I've got many more questions, but it's time to go to the audience. And if we do have time and it doesn't come up, I want to come to China for a moment before we're through, because that's something you know a lot about, and you have some very interesting views. Let me just say, we're being, what is it, radio tonight or television? It's television. And we're on television tonight. And so we've been asked that when you ask a question, wait for the mic and please stand up. Okay, with that, it's open. Yes, sir, we'll start right here. Mic coming your way.
Thank you. This is addressed to Jim, and I want to push you a little bit further on the evolution that you're talking about. And what I found interesting about your book was the title of the chapter on Carter, The Soul of America. And what I want to push you on is that Carter was the first evangelical president. And what he did was to combine the new theology of the free market evangelicals with the free market of the Democratic Party. And I think what you have to look deeper at is this question of what they mean by democracy. And are they simply talking about free market? It does not appear that any of this conversation is talking about the redistribution of wealth. And in terms of the question that you raised about international law, I recently attended some lectures with Jeremy Waldron, and the question was raised as to Nuremberg and international law. And the question was, what was the defense and how was it put aside? I was only following orders, and it was this was a crime against humanity. And the point that I made there is that, yes, international law came in and played a role. But at the exact same time that Nuremberg was addressing the issues, the conversation that Curtis LeMay had with McNamara concerning the firebombing of Tokyo, when questioned by McNamara, Curtis LeMay said, if we win the war, we're heroes. If we lose the war, we're war criminals. So I think you really have to address this question of what happened when Carter was talking about the soul of America. And I think the relationship between the new evangelical Christian right that has made a theology of the free market and the fact that democracy in terms of the NGOs that you're talking about are always based on the free market.
Okay, let's get a response for you.
But just one last comment, which is, if you look at how we address the difference between trade with the Soviet Union and trade with China, you see a change that has occurred now, which is that we can now tolerate and work with, as a market economy, those countries that no longer have any interest in human rights, and China and Tibet and the Uyghurs and all those other things.
Very good, thanks.
All right, well, you've asked a very short and simple question, but actually filled with many comments. And I'm just going to zero in on really the market issue, because I think it is a very fundamental and critical one. I think it's true that when Carter came to power, there was a movement towards putting democratization and the market ethos closer and closer together. And I think it's something that partly came out of the discrediting of the Great Society by Vietnam, and I think it was also partly the impact of the civil rights movement in the South itself, which gave rise to a conservative Republican Party. Lyndon Johnson was no fool when he said to one of his biographers, when he signed the Voting Rights Act, there goes the Democratic Party in the South for 25 years. Yeah. The Vietnam War was a disaster for certain progressive tendencies in this country, I think. And I don't think we've actually fully gotten over that piece. Now, within that, on the market, I think we also had the rise, a rapid rise in the 70s of the multinational corporations, the effort to think of democracy increasingly as a pattern of consumerism, a loss of what I would call a sort of collective spirit. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. used to say all the time, he said, look, if we're going to actually have democracy in a country and good law, you still have to have people mobilized, working for it every single day of the week. It doesn't just stay put. You've got to really struggle for it. And part of his own frustration towards the end of his life was that he saw how great the gap was growing on inequality, and how the market, and this goes to the second curve, how the market isn't able to deal with it. these issues of freedom of speech and the right of association are all very important, and indeed extremely important in terms of being able to mobilize, to figure out how to rethink. But one of the elements that's happening in the Middle East, as in other parts of the world, is I don't think there is an American model of development. I don't think there actually is a development of model. I don't believe in the Chinese development model either. I believe different countries in different ways are struggling to try to get there within what we understand to be this sort of global market framework. But it's not going to come by some sort of automatic involvement in the market. It's going to have to come through an enormous amount of experimentation and struggle and, unfortunately, a great deal of conflict to try to find ways that billions of people can be brought into some way of participating and having well-being and meaningful lives on the planet.
So I want to ask my China question now, if I can. Just because it's front and center. It's a very mixed picture in China. They've passed a flurry of laws in recent years, and yet it's still, rule of law is somewhat questionable there, particularly for the party, which is still above the law. They are doing all sorts of social and economic things, some of which are really quite admirable, and the results are terrific. At the same time, inequality is growing at a faster rate than anywhere else in the world. Is there enough there going on to be viewed as a serious alternative route to be going down for other countries? Or has China got more problems than it knows what to do with, and inequality is going to kill them?
You've got several questions in there that are, I think, very good questions. I think China is an extraordinarily fascinating place. I think there's an enormous amount happening there. In the years I worked there, I found people critical, questioning, open, dynamic, except on the issue of the existence of the Communist Party, which they were quiet, careful, and cautious. But within that, I think China has there are various kinds of struggles at various levels, which we do not understand well in this country, coming out of their own traditions, in struggles in their own way. And one of my criticisms, as you know from reading the book, is part of the dilemma of the way the human rights movement in the West looks at China is they look at it too closely through often quite heroic individuals, but individuals that are easier to identify with, and which in many cases are getting funds from the American government. Something which I think is a serious mistake. When Liu Xiaobo gets the Peace Prize and his magazine is partly funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, or when I first went to work in China and for various reasons, well, the reason is because I was working in Random House in Pantheon at the time, and one of the Knopf authors was married to the ambassador's wife, and so I was sort of required to make a call. And I went there, and there was a soiree, and it was filled with the people who later became very prominent in Tiananmen. Now, if you could imagine some sort of comparable contrast in this country, where Americans were busily associating with people in a foreign embassy, you start to get a sense of where I think Americans don't quite understand the gap that exists over the kinds of struggles going on there that they actually know very little about. And that there's something to be said for for believing that they're quite capable of making their struggles in their own way. This I'm very confident about the Chinese. Their inequality is staggering. The problems that they've developed in ecology are huge. And yet there's an enormous vitality in
there's
society.
There's a dynamism socially.
And there's not the sense that you have in certain countries of the debilitating impact of poverty. So there is great poverty.
Yeah.
But I think the interest in China, which is going to, it's a germinating, it's going to break through and surprise us in various ways, but they're not necessarily going to be the ways that conform to our conceptions.
Right. More questions? Yes, ma'am, right back there.
Hi, thank you. Good evening. Thank you for taking my question. I'm a student here at this, and I apologize. This question doesn't have anything directly related to your book, but you mentioned the right to prevent, both of you, and I don't know if you meant responsibility to protect. But Mr. Peck, you assert or you imply that this intervention is hardly humanitarian. So I was wondering what you would identify are the real motives, and also what vital interests that we're pursuing.
Good.
Well, I think the motives, I think, are pretty consistent in American operations. I think the fundamental concern of American involvement is the ability of the Americans to still remain the preeminent power. Now, they can operate in various ways at various times, and it gets called into it gets involved in situations like Libya. It's not necessarily oil, but it is a lot to do with power, the functioning of NATO and the rest. It's not, but my point really, and I could certainly go into the details of geopolitical strategy, which I think have not fundamentally shifted all that much in 60 years. But my main point really is that's the issue. Those are the kinds of issues to look at rather than the ideals. Just as it is one way into some of those issues to try and understand why Chancellor Merkel has not gone along with the intervention. This actually is an extremely interesting development in Europe. But when you try to read the New York Times, and if you were still a publisher, we probably wouldn't have this problem. We could read, but if you try to read the New York Times, what you basically find are criticisms of Merkel or quotes by people who say, really, there's something deeply wrong with this woman. But there's something more fundamental happening here among parts of Europe as well, that the interventionism isn't going to work any longer as a right to protect if it goes back down to the same small handful of Western powers. Though that era is coming to an end, as I said before, it's not going to help the right to protect. And as I said, if one were truly concerned with the right to protect, you would have a differently organized UN, which I hope someday comes. Because sometime in the 20, 30, 40 years from now, people are going to look back and say, just as they look at the inequalities we now live with, and they're going to say something's terribly wrong, they're going to look at a UN and say, this kind of organization made no sense. You have the wrong powers, it's not operating certain ways, you don't have the Indians involved, you don't have other powers, and you have the French and the British there. Sorry, this isn't quite working. So if you're going to have a role for power to protect, you have to, I think, in the end, have some sort of semi-autonomous. Now, sounds good, and I know that's hard to get, and I'm not sure I'm going to live to see it in my lifetime. And yet, sometimes you do have to argue for things that could be considered utopian, because you're never going to get there otherwise.
Yes, sir.
Would you say that's in America's best interest or for human rights pursuits?
To
To pursue human rights, America's best interest.
I'd be glad, it reminds me of the line that Gandhi...
Chile and Nicaragua.
But it reminds me of the line Gandhi was asked about, what do you think about Western civilization? And he said, well, I think it'd be a good idea. That's would be my answer about the United States.
Yes. Yes, sir. Right here.
I have a couple of questions.
Take the mic, please.
I have a couple of questions. One is, I do think perhaps your idea is utopian. It's hard. I'm trying to imagine the kind of calculus, constitutional calculus, that would take place of having multiple small states and having some powerful states agreeing that we're going to have some kind of a democratic decision on the use of force by a third party. And I'm not sure that we really like the results all that well. And I ask you to speculate on what you think you'd really get if you got what you wanted, which sometimes, as you know, is dangerous. The other, I want to return to China, because I think you do have an interesting contrast of two regimes, one of which concentrated on equality with the most disastrous results imaginable, mass starvation and so on, and one which is less concerned with equality, but which has pulled many, many more Chinese out of poverty. And it seems to me a kind of an irony, one being a more market-oriented, one being totally unmarket-oriented. And I wondered if you could comment on that disparity.
Okay, well, there are two very different questions. Let me stay on the China one. Let me just hit on a brief point on the China one. I'm not one of those who argues that the market reforms that were developed in China were possible without the revolution. I think this is a profound misunderstanding of the radical changes that occurred in China since 1949. The prevailing vision of the Chinese Revolution is the further we get away from it, the better we are. I actually don't think that it gets us very far to understand the kind of changes that have occurred. That doesn't wipe out some of the horrific things that happened, but it suggests that there's a historical trajectory here that's very profound. Secondly, and I would tie this back to something when I was talking about hostility to the revolution, one of the things people have really not struggled with about China is what it was like for China in 1949. The United States is on Taiwan. It's blockading all the major cities of China that were the treaty ports. And you have 100 million people in those ports whose trade had once been directed externally, and no longer can China develop in that road. It's going to have to figure out how to develop, because of that hostility, I think significantly, a kind of revolutionary pattern that turns deeply inward. Now, the traditional argument is, oh, they wanted to go that direction, that's why they did it. I actually think it's much more complicated, a very complicated dynamic between revolutions and hostility and the rest. And China has partly, just as in a very more easily seen way, as was true in Nicaragua or in Chile, but China has also had to face initially extraordinary burdens and problems to deal with. So I put the revolution in a much more variated and complicated relationship. As to seeing my wishes ever come true, I can assure you this doesn't happen very often, so on foreign policy in particular. So don't get any of your hopes up. But my point is, there are, the right to protect, the reason I think the number of times it would be used would be small, but the difficulty has been that because the great powers have gotten involved, and Yugoslavia would be another example, because they've gotten so deeply involved, it has been their interests that have guided the process itself. And there's no way out of that, I think. Now, there may not be an alternative, but it's the only one that I can even vaguely envision, that there are moments that you simply use some sort of force that's not rooted in the interest of the great powers to try to put a cap on some horrendous development before your eyes.
Yes, sir.
The discussion of China seems to focus on economic inequality. As important as that is, with respect to human rights, shouldn't there also be a discussion of the brute use of force, whether it's Tiananmen Square, whether it's capital punishment on a scale which exceeds the rest of the world combined, whether it is the continuing disappearance and torture of dissidents and lawyers taking place right now?
I would say absolutely. I think there are a lot of very brave people in China. I deplore their arrest. I think their right to speak and to organize should be unrestricted, and I think we should know as much as possible about them, even with my comments about some of the funding issues that are involved. I would point out that you are speaking in a country that has the largest prison population on the planet, bigger than China's, and that we should be a little careful about some of these kinds of conclusions between the two societies. The United States, the Chinese, and this is also, of course, on the second group, the Chinese sometimes look at the United States and say, well, you sometimes say we should follow the American model. What's the American model? Well, find a continent that only has Indians on it that you can get rid of, develop it, become incredibly wealthy, not have foreign powers on your borders, and have the American model. Now, that's being a little flip, and I don't mean to be, because there are, China, I think, has, my hope for China is that out of what is going to be a long period of struggle, and it is going to take several decades, there will gradually emerge other, more open kinds of political movements that will allow a much greater degree of freedom. These are things that I find are on people's minds, but they are certainly not yet tolerated by the existence of the Communist Party, which cannot be yet challenged in its existence. It's almost the one thing you cannot say. I do not think, however, it's my own personal opinion, that it particularly helps the political organizations in China to be so closely connected to Western groups. I think that's a profound mistake. And I thought it was a profound mistake in the United States.
China, don't you think?
Yes. But I also thought it was a mistake in this country, in the 60s, to be too connected to foreign powers. But I think China is, it happens to be something true of many great powers.
Right. Well, the right to protect, you know, in the real world, one of the problems that's already there, and it's going to be there even bigger as we go forward, which is we're going to exercise the right to protect occasionally when it suits our interests and when the power that's being addressed is small enough not to be a strategic challenge. Can you see us using the right to protect to intervene in China? I don't.
No.
No. I hope we don't.
Well, the point is you can't use this is part of the, I mean, we live in as we know, in an extraordinarily unjust world.
Yes.
There's no way that the right to protect is going to be used against any great power, because it would be a war.
Right, exactly.
And so we are really talking about those countries that at certain moments, in a way, all hell breaks loose. But this is what's part of the problem with the right to protect, I think, because we've been talking about it as it relates to military force. But it is part of something that I think really has to be rethought, which is this gloss of humanitarianism over practically everything, as I said earlier, from nation building to counterinsurgency, to what's going on in Afghanistan, to rebuilding nations in Iraq. These are all these things are not isolated. And as I say in the book, you could almost call the 90s the age of the victim. Now, victims it's who wants to be a victim? But the victimization became a way of encouraging a justification for a new kind of role for the American government to deal with what were called failed states, not one of my favorite terms,
right,
or to deal with, in the end, terrorism. And as you know from the book, it's not a term that I think is an appropriate one to use, and one which the human rights community divides on.
right.
Because Human Rights Watch uses the term.
We do.
And Amnesty does not. And I think, nor does the BBC. And I think it's an important point, not that I was asked it, but it's an important point, because I think terrorism is a little like the word communism. It links up all sorts of different kinds of events in different parts of the world and makes it seem like there's some coherency by which places like Washington can act against and then mobilize to use these astonishing defense funds. I mean, one of the things that Martin Luther King said before he died was that if this country couldn't figure out a way to cut back radically its military-industrial complex, we were going to end up, it was going to be a soul-killing nation. We weren't going to make it. And there was a line that Fulbright also used when he said, well, it isn't just the military-industrial complex, he said, it's the military-industrial academic complex, and he was bringing all together this lack of certain kinds of criticism. Well, the problem with the word terrorism, I think, is it's a thought-stopping word. It doesn't take us very far.
It's also very indiscriminate. I mean,
Yes.
Particularly in the hands of some of our leaders who use it much too freely to describe all
very
kinds.
effectively.
And very effectively, I'm afraid, yes.
Yes, because, and it fits in with another piece, which is in the book, which is, what is terrorism? It's defined by and large as the death of innocent civilians.
Right.
But proportional killing of people in military campaigns, that's not terrorism. So you don't, I mean, you could use the word state terrorism, but by and large, nobody uses it. And so my option has been, I mean, people do use it. Chomsky, others use it extremely effectively. But I would argue we would have a better understanding of the world if we drop the term and try to use exactly the language appropriate to what those incidents are, whether it's an assassination or a bombing or a shooting or a slaughter, call it what you will, and that it would require us to think less ideologically about the world.
We've been talking a good deal about the two currents of Human Rights Watch, and maybe that's a good point to end on, because it's with us very much in what's going on in the Middle East. Now, this is anecdotal, but as I listen to the young people that are getting quoted and end up on television, there are two things that come over and over again, and it's not Islamic, it's not religion, it is economic justice, and it's political freedom. And we've been discussing a little bit about whether we've got the balance right on how, which of those we pay how much attention to. The book is here. I think you can get a sense from listening to Jim that he is quite eloquent. This is a beautifully written book. And the documentation is just astounding. I read quite a bit about human rights and civil rights and whatnot else. There are very few books I know of that have quite the document, if you will, the data strength that this book has. In any event, thank you so much. It was a very good discussion.
Thank you very much.
You're watching 48 hours of nonfiction authors and books on C-SPAN 2's Book TV.